All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome in. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us on this beautiful day. We really appreciate you coming together to hear from our three panelists today who will be introduced shortly. Also, our moderator, Cassandra Lamontagne, is the Sustainability Coordinator, and she'll be moderating the conversation and introducing it in a minute. So I just wanted to say welcome to this event, Urban Biodiversity in Montreal. Why should we care? Question mark. For those of you unfamiliar with us, Concordia University's Force Space is located in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Indigenous land. We are a university-wide platform focused on working collaboratively with our community across the disciplines and essentially to activate the research that's happening behind closed doors, the various teaching activities and other initiatives. So we are currently recording this session and live streaming at CU Force Space, and I'll pop both those links in the chat as soon as I'm finished speaking. You're more than welcome to join in the conversation today. There will be a Q&A after the three presentations, and we ask that you pop your questions into the Q&A box, making Cassandra's life a little bit easier as the place she looks for questions she might want to share with the panelists. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to lift your virtual hand and we will unmute you so that you can speak. Okay, on that note, I'm passing the floor over to you, Cassandra.
Great, thank you, Anna. So yeah, thank you so much all of you for being here today. This event is part of a series that the Office of Sustainability has developed for the WWF Living Planet at Campus program. If you've never heard of this program, Concordia signed on as a partner last year, and the aims are to increase community engagement around sustainability with a specific focus on wildlife biodiversity and conservation. And so I'm very pleased that we have with us today our biology professors who are going to teach us something new about the species that surround us in Montreal. And at the conclusion of the event, I'll be outlining a few associated activities that we've developed to allow you to put your newfound or renewed excitement about nature into action. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers today. We have Carly Zeder, an assistant professor in biology, Emma Desplans, a professor in biology, as well as Rebecca Titler, a part-time faculty in the departments of biology, geography, and the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability. As well, she coordinates the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability and the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. So reiterate what Anna said, you can put your questions in the Q&A box and I'll be monitoring that. We'll ask easier, shorter questions to our panelists or our speakers at the conclusion of their presentations, and we'll have a discussion at the end with your questions as well. So I shall pass it over to Carly.
Okay, great. Thanks, Cassandra. Let me share my screen here and hope that this works the right way. All right, so hopefully you are all seeing my screen and not my presenter view here. Thank you to Anna and Cassandra for the introduction, and it's really nice to be here today with two of my colleagues in the biology department and at the Loyola College for Sustainability and Diversity, Emma and Rebecca, who you'll hear from after this. So I get the fun job of kind of introducing our topic today, and particularly thinking about why we should care about biodiversity in the city in general. And so to start, I want you all to think about, to picture the word biodiversity. Close your eyes. If I say, think about a really biodiverse space, what kind of space do you think of? And some of you are probably thinking about some pretty wild spaces, right? Maybe you're thinking about coral reefs or mountain ranges, the tropical rainforest, the African savanna. These are certainly all biodiverse spaces. You wouldn't be wrong to picture these, but there is a lot more biodiversity close to home that we sometimes ignore, which is what we're going to talk about today. And so to start, what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is the variability among living organisms. So we can talk about this from, genes all the way up to whole, biomes or larger areas of the planet. But we're really thinking about the diversity or the variability within species, within ecosystems. So biodiversity is about differences. And as I mentioned, we might think about these kind of far off places when we think about biodiversity, but there's a huge amount of variability in the species that surround us every day. So this is a picture from the Champ de Passible, which is in a really dense part of Mile End in Montreal, where we have a small prairie restoration. And if you go there, in a few weeks, when we're really properly into spring, you'll see lots of things, starting to grow, insects starting to buzz. So why do we care about this biodiversity surrounding us? And I'm going to give you a couple of different reasons today. And the first one is something I think a lot about, which is this idea of ecosystem services, that biodiversity can make us happier, healthier, and safer in our cities. So, for example, some of you have taken classes with me and you're like, why does she keep talking about these same things? So I'm sorry if you've heard these slides before, but you've probably seen me show pictures like this, right? Where we talk about how plants reduce temperatures in the city, protecting us from heat waves. They can capture nutrients or reduce air pollution and smog, store carbon, which is important for climate change and climate resilient cities. This image is focused on plants because that's what I tend to think about, but you'll hear about some other examples later today for some of our other organisms. And I wanted to point out, this quote from Montreal's Climate Action Plan that I think really emphasizes this concept of ecosystem services, where a mature tree absorbs rainwater, filters the air, reduces noise pollution, provides an ecosystem for many animal species, and so on and so on. And so increasing the number of trees is one of the most significant actions we can take to better adapt to climate change, to make our cities safer and healthier spaces. And I think we're more aware of these benefits now than ever before. And if we look at this survey from the organization Park People, who surveyed thousands of Canadians about their appreciation for parks, which is where we find a lot of our urban biodiversity, and more than 80% of respondents emphasize that parks are important for their mental health. Their appreciation of parks increased, either slightly or greatly. And cities, municipal leaders overwhelmingly are now more aware of the value of parks for public health, for crisis resiliency. So these are real tangible benefits people are receiving. And some of you might be thinking, I just spent time defining biodiversity as a variability, as differences in species. And now I'm just talking kind of about green space. So do we actually need biodiversity, or do we just need things to be green? And this is a really important question that ecologists are still asking about. And there are a few things that we know. So we know that different kinds of organisms give us different benefits. So for example, here is a beautiful, huge elm tree very close to Loyola campus. Um, Many elm trees were died in the past due to Dutch elm disease. So it's rare to see these big, beautiful examples. And this kind of tree, it's going to store a lot of carbon. It's going to provide a lot of shade. It's going to provide particular benefits to us compared to, say, a serviceberry, another native tree species here in Quebec. Some of you might know this as a Saskatoon berry tree. And it's providing us benefits too, right? It's beautiful. It's used in landscaping. We like its aesthetics. We can pick its berries to make pie. Birds appreciate its berries as well. So if you want to bird watch, you might want to plant a Saskatoon tree. So having diversity, having different kinds and forms and functions of organisms might give us a broader range of these benefits. And there's some emerging evidence, and Rebecca's going to talk a lot more about birds, but there's some emerging evidence that increased biodiversity, more than just green space, can benefit our mental health. And so this particular study that came out recently was done in Europe and found that higher bird biodiversity, so having more species of birds surrounding you, actually made people more joyful. It made people happier. And this happiness was on par with having more money. So here you see in blue, the proportional increase in your household income. So to a point, if you make money, you tend to be happier. We say money doesn't buy happiness, but it helps to some extent. And then you can see the increase in birds. So increasing the number of birds, the biodiversity surrounding you can increase your satisfaction and your happiness in this particular study as much as having a little bit more money. And biodiversity provides resilience. So basically helps us to maintain our urban nature and its benefits even when times are hard. So if I showed you this picture of this street, this is the street in Ohio, but it very well could be a street here in Montreal. This is a pretty nice looking street, right? It looks shady, it looks cool. There's probably some nice houses here. You know, I'd like to live on this nice tree covered street. The problem with this street is that it's all one species and it's all ash species. So some of you might be familiar with the emerald ash borer, which is an invasive insect. And this is what that street looked like 3 years later in Ohio, where every single tree is now dead. And so if we had had more biodiversity, we'd had more variety of trees, that would have helped to buffer this street against some of these shocks, these invasions, or other kinds of global change. An emerald ash borer is a really big threat here in Montreal. So we have more than 1 million ash trees in the city that are in the process of being both treated and removed. The great thing about trees is that you can replant them, but of course it will take a very long time. So it will take years or decades for these tiny new trees to be providing those benefits that we're getting from these much larger ones. So that's my first reasons we should care about urban biodiversity. And that's the one I'm going to spend the most time on today because it's closest to what I study and think about. But there are other reasons as well, right? It provides us an opportunity to understand and connect with nature. This is something we often call the pigeon paradox. So experiencing urban nature, something as simple as a pigeon, can connect people to nature and make them behave in more environmentally conscious ways, kind of in general. And we can make a difference for species by managing our green spaces to be more biodiverse. So particularly if we think about bees, there are many species of bees, and I think Emma will talk more about how many species of bees we have here in Montreal. And so I may be giving away a little bit of a hint here by showing, where there's at least more than one. And so this example, this bright green sweat bee is Toronto's official bee, which is kind of fun to think about. But we can actually conserve species right here in our cities and make a difference for nature. And not every species is going to live in the city, right? Some things just are not going to live in these urban habitats, in these small green spaces, but many species have to pass through. So improving the biodiversity in our city, improving the vegetation and the trees and the habitat that species are kind of stopping over on their way can help us to reduce the barriers to species in a much broader area. And so putting these together, why do we care about biodiversity in cities? It can make us happier, healthier, and safer by providing ecosystem services. It allows us a way to connect with nature. It allows us to support local conservation and regional conservation. And in my last 2 minutes here, I'm going to talk a little bit more about why I really care about urban biodiversity. The reasons I just presented are important to me. They're important to me, particularly kind of on a logical and an academic level. I know it's important to have biodiversity in our cities, but also it's just really fascinating to have interesting biodiversity in our cities. It's interesting. And so I'm going to talk about trees, and I'm going to mention just a few trees that I find really interesting. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is yellow birch, or Betula aeruginosa. And this is Quebec's provincial tree. So we have a provincial tree in Quebec. It's yellow birch. You usually find this more often in kind of forested areas. If you've been hiking in some of our natural areas outside the city, you might see a lot of yellow birch, but you can find them in the city if you look in the right places, which some of you will in our scavenger hunt. And a fun fact I love about this tree is if you scratch its twigs, it smells just like peppermint, which is one of those things that is just a really fun, interesting, magical thing when you learn the species around you. Here's a ginkgo tree. Ginkgos are non-native, so they are originally from China. And ginkgo trees are what we call a living fossil. And so this species has remained basically unchanged for the past 50 million years. and more. Ginkgo trees have survived atomic bombs. Ginkgo trees are really commonly planted in cities because they're resistant to pollutants, they're resistant to a lot of insects. And a very fun thing about ginkgos is they tend to drop all their leaves on one day. So we can actually use them to track things like changes in phenology or in seasons by watching when they drop their leaves. And you can find these in Montreal as well. And the last tree I'll share with you today is a silver maple. Some of Canada's biggest and oldest silver maples are actually in NDG in the neighborhood surrounding Loyola campus. These trees they predate Confederation. They're older than Canada is as a country. You can see someone walking on this sidewalk here, quite small, next to this tree. And they have this kind of distinctive, almost shaggy bark, so you can find them even now when they don't have their leaves yet. If you are interested in trees, there is a great book by Bronwyn Chester that goes through 50 trees in Montreal and talks about some kind of personal stories about those. And to end my piece of the talk today, what can we do to protect and grow our urban biodiversity? We can learn, we can plant, and we can support. So learning starts with observing the world around you. Cassandra is going to talk more about some specific resources and apps you can use, and these will come up in some of our other talks today as well. For example, using iNaturalist or eBird. You can read, so there are a ton of books right now about urban nature and urban naturalists. If you have space to plant, consider planting a native or a wildlife-friendly species. You can ask me questions about why I'm talking about native species later. If you don't have space, join us in some of our planting initiatives on campus or support a local organization that often has activities where you can volunteer. And so with that, there's a general introduction to why we care about urban biodiversity, a little bit about trees because I couldn't help but sneak a few things in. And then Emma and Rebecca are going to talk about some of our really fascinating insects and birds that we can find right here in Montreal.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Carly. We don't actually have any questions yet in the Q&A. So again, if anyone has questions for anyone, put them in the Q&A and we'll either address them at the end in a discussion, or if there's something more specific, we'll be asking our presenters about them at the conclusion of their presentation. So without further ado, then we'll move on to Rebecca. And yeah, that was awesome. Thanks, Carly.
I think we're going to Emma next.
Oh, it's to Emma. I apologize. I had the order wrong. On to Emma and a presentation about insects.
Okay, thank you. So what I've got a title here, The Little Things That Run the City. That's based on a quote from E.O. Wilson, who calls insects the little things that run the world. So I'm being a little bit less ambitious than him here. But why does he say that? And basically what this graph shows here is the number of known animal species. So all the species of animals that we know that have been cataloged according to the different groups to which they belong. And on this graph, all the different colors of blue are the different groups of insects. So these here are the moths and butterflies. These are the ants, bees, wasps. These are all the beetles. These are the true bugs. These are the flies. These are all the other insects. These are spiders, mites, ticks. These are crustaceans. All of these are arthropods, but you can see 3/4 of all the animal species are insects. Just some of these other groups, these are the mollusks, so snails, clams, mussels, things like that. Yellow is the fish, birds, reptiles, and the mammals here are in orange. So when we talk about insects as being the things that run the world, well, 3/4 of all animals are insects, and mammals here are this very small, there's really not that many of them. Okay, so this is a portrait of all the animals on Earth. If we look more closely at Montreal, I'm going to go through a few groups kind of very briefly. This is going to be a little bit of a poll, so I'm going to ask you this as a question. Let me launch the poll. How many bee species do you think there are in Montreal? Now, while you're looking at that, I'm going to point out that this is an impossible question to answer. I mean, if you really wanted the full answer to this question, you would have to go out there and catch every single bee and identify its species. So of course, we don't have a full answer, but there was a study done addressing this a few years ago. So this guy here, Etienne Normandin, for his master's degree, he went and collected bees in several different habitat types across Montreal. We took them all home and took them all to the lab, identified every single one, and he came up with an answer that we're pretty confident is the total number of bee species in Montreal. So we'll see what people are getting from the poll. So here are your results from the poll. And you've done a pretty good job because the answer is 177. Now, bees are always a bit tricky because the way that we use the word bee, people often think of the honeybee. And this is the most common, it's the best known species. It's the one that we raise for honey. But Lawrence Packer, who's an entomologist who studies bees, points out that honeybee is a domesticated animal. It's livestock. So it's one species, but equating honeybee with bees is kind of the same thing as equating chickens with birds. There's lots of bees that are not the honeybee, just like there's lots of birds that are not chickens. So if we look at some of examples of the other bees of Montreal, the ones that people are probably most familiar with are bumblebees. And there too, you might not be aware there's more than one species of bumblebee. There is the common eastern bumblebee, which as its name suggests is the one you're most likely to see around. But there is also the tricolored bumblebee. Can't see it very well. It's this little bee here on this flower. There's also the two-spotted bumblebee, the red-belted bumblebee, the brown-belted bumblebee. And I'm just going to point out that these are all photographs from the iNaturalist app that we'll mention later on. And they're all taken from Montreal. So these are photographs taken by people, you know, bee aficionados who've gone out and photographed these bees and uploaded them to the app and identified them. So this does give us data about, you know, bees that have been seen in Montreal. Okay, so they're bumblebees. They're the biggest, the most kind of visible ones. And you can kind of guess that their names are based on what they look like. So the red-belted bumblebee has got this red belt on the back of its body. You can guess the two-spotted bumblebee has two spots, and so on. So bumblebees are some of those non-honeybee bees. There are also a whole wide range of other ones. So these, for example, are all bees. They're in the family Halictidae. They are ground-dwelling, and they've got these beautiful metallic green colors. So if you look closely at flowers, you might get a chance to see one of these really spectacular bees. Okay, bees are one group of animals. Next one I'm going to ask about is ants. So I've got a poll here too. How many species of ants are there in Montreal? So here again, this is kind of an impossible question to answer. We have a less complete answer than we do for bees. So this was based on a study that was done on the Molson Nature Reserve. So this is in Île-Perrot. So it's not exactly in Montreal, but it's very close to Montreal, where they trapped ants in forest edges, in forest interiors, and in people's backyards. And the ants are actually kind of less diverse than the bees, at least around here, because what they found in this study, the data are here. So interior are the species they found within the forest, edge is along the forest edge, urban is in people's backyards. And each one of those places they found between 50 and 20 species of ants. So this is not a full answer, but it gives you an idea of the biodiversity of ants that you could have in your backyard if you lived in Île-Perrot. If you live elsewhere, it's probably very similar. So among those ants, I'm just going to mention the two most common ones that we see in the sort of downtown area. Carpenter ants, people are probably familiar with. They're often kind of thought of as pests because they are carpenter ants. They build their nests in dead wood, and so you often do see them around houses. Identifying ants to species is actually quite hard to do, but basically, if it's a big ant, so you know, a centimeter long, it's in a very urban downtown kind of environment, it's probably a carpenter ant. The other species that's quite common in very urbanized downtown sort of areas are the turfgrass ants. So these, the ants themselves are very small. They're only a couple millimeters long. This is what the nests look like. So this probably looks familiar to some of you. It's this very small little mound with a hole in the middle, and you can see them in the cracks in the sidewalk, in driveways, in playgrounds. These are turf grass ant nests, and obviously as the nests are very small, the ants themselves are very small as well. Some more perhaps charismatic insects. This is one of the earliest butterflies you see in the spring, and I'm going to encourage, if anybody is like a butterfly amateur and knows what this is, could you perhaps write it out in the chat? So this is a species, it's one of the earliest butterflies you see in the spring, and now is the time to see them. So if you look around, you might see some of these. They overwinter as adults. So the butterfly itself spends the winter locally, in Quebec, hidden in cracks in the wood and the bark of trees or another kind of sheltered habitats. And let me just check the chat. Does anyone know what this is? Maybe not. Oh, we've got one name in. No, okay.
There's a name in the Q&A box. So Victoria.
Okay, there we go. Yep, it's a mourning cloak. Good for you. So it's a mourning cloak. It's known as the Moriot in French, and that's the scientific name. So one of the earliest butterflies that you see in the spring, because it overwinters as a butterfly. So as soon as temperatures get warm, it's ready, it becomes active, and you can see them around. Now is about when they're emerging. Here's another very early spring butterfly. Anyone know what this is? So this has a completely different life history strategy. These ones migrate, so they go south for the winter, but they also come back very early in the spring. And now is just about when we'll start seeing them too. And yes, this is a red admiral, or a vulcain in French. There is also a white admiral, but which is slightly different. This is a red admiral. Again, another very early spring butterfly, but this one is migratory. So it goes south for the winter and then comes back in early spring. This is a trick question. Does anyone know what this is? And I'm warning you in advance, this is unfair. It's a trick question. Because there's actually a number of different possible answers. So there's actually a whole subfamily of butterflies that are called the blue butterflies. And they're called the blue butterflies because the top side of the wing, so when they've got their wings open, they look like this, they're blue. However, to tell the species apart, you can look at the underside of the wings. So someone there has the common blue, that's partially right, that's almost there. So
there's also Victoria in the Q&A saying blue sulfur.
Blue sulfur. Yeah, so this is why this is a trick question. The blues are actually hard to tell apart. When you see only the top part of the wing, you can't tell which one it is. You need to see the underside of the wing as well. So one possibility, if you saw this in Montreal, one possibility would be the silvery blue. So here you see one with its wings open, one with the wings shut. With the wings open, the top of the wings is blue, looks like that. With the wings shut, you see the under pattern, and that tells you that that's the silvery blue, which is a native species. However, if you saw this in downtown Montreal, it's more likely to be this, which is an introduced species. So the European common blue, which again, the top of the wings looks the same. The underside of the wing, as you can tell, has got a very different pattern. And this is the European common blue, which has only been in the Montreal area for about 15 years. So it was introduced 15 years ago, and it was accidentally introduced. And it's becoming more and more widespread, such that now in really kind of urban settings, this is the more common blue butterfly that you're likely to see. Got one final butterfly question, the monarch or viceroy, which one is which? So I'll launch this as a poll again. So I think, as most people know, monarchs feed mostly on milkweed plants. Milkweed plants are toxic. So if you were a bird and you were looking for a butterfly snack, you should not eat a monarch because it's toxic and it would make you sick. So you should avoid the monarchs. However, there's no reason not to eat viceroys. Viceroys are perfectly palatable and edible for birds. The question is, you'd have to be able to tell which one is which. So I guess this poll here is sort of asking you, you know, are you a good butterfly predator? Can you tell which one of these you should eat and which one you shouldn't? And as you can see, this is not an easy question. So this is a good example of what's called Batesian mimicry, where the monarch is protected from predators because it's toxic, and the viceroy acquires protection from predators by looking like a monarch and therefore confusing predators, and so the predators end up not eating either. Okay, so if we look at the question, which is the monarch, which is the viceroy? And the answer is here, this one is the monarch. That one's the viceroy, and the way you can tell the difference is this little line, this black line in the hind wing. The viceroy has got this line, the monarch does not. So I guess this is a pretty telling example that Batesian mimicry can be very, very effective. Okay, that's it for butterflies. I am going to mention grasshoppers because they're kind of my favorites and I think they're just really cool. But grasshoppers you're much more likely to see towards the end of the summer rather than now. One of the most common grasshoppers you're likely to see around Montreal is the red-legged grasshopper that you see here. Again, named for sort of obvious reason. Another species that's very common is what's known as the Carolina grasshopper. And when it's on the ground, you're not likely to see it because, as you can tell here, it's pretty well camouflaged. They're difficult to see. If, however, you get close and it feels threatened, it does what's known as a startle response, which means it flies away. And as it flies away, it opens the front wings, which are kind of brown and camouflaged, so that you see the back wings that have this striking black and yellow pattern. This is called a startled response because all of a sudden you see this brightly colored thing appearing out of the ground. It's quite noisy when it flies, so it goes clack, 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 and then it drops to the ground and disappears and it's gone and you can't find it again. I don't know if anybody's ever experienced this. Usually you see them in like August, September. Is this something people ever seen before? Yeah, so that's what it is. It's a Carolina grasshopper. It hasn't actually completely disappeared. It's just camouflaged, and it's done its job. If you were a predator, it's avoided you. Okay, so following on from Carly and from, I guess, the theme of, you know, what's the use of urban biodiversity? Why should we care? I felt I should touch a little bit on ecosystem services given by insects, especially ecosystem services that are relevant in the city. And that's a difficult question to answer because they're so huge. I mean, insects are they're really at the basis of all terrestrial ecosystems. And so trying to imagine, you know, a terrestrial ecosystem without insects is like imagining a house without walls. It just doesn't exist. It can't work. But I came up with two ecosystem services that I think are pretty telling. The first one is this idea of pollination, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. So most flowering plants are pollinated by insects. You lose the insects, those plants are no longer able to reproduce. And this obviously has consequences in terms of, you know, our food production, but also ecosystems in general and the very existence of plants. So the existence of flowering plants really is tied in with the existence of insects, and they have co-evolved together. Another ecosystem service worth mentioning, I think, is decomposition. So soil insects are very good decomposers in terms of any, you know, waste matter that's found in the soil, and they have been doing this for millions and millions of years. And this is perhaps less glamorous as an ecosystem service, but we're still very glad that, you know, they're here and they're doing it for us. I think one final ecosystem service I'd like to mention as well is just that insects are so cool. They're fascinating, they're exciting, they're really neat. And I think as a scientist, maybe one way to say this is that insects being so successful show us another way of being an animal, show us other ways of functioning that is different from human biology. But I think this slide also shows that you do not need to be a highly trained scientist to be fascinated by insects. And I think another point that I want to mention with this slide is that we're lucky in Montreal that we don't have any very dangerous or venomous insects or spiders. So there really isn't any good reason to get close, any good reason not to get close to them and enjoy them like these kids are doing here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was wonderful and very, very interesting. We have one question from Diego before we move on to Rebecca's presentation. What would be the consequences of including a new butterfly species to the city?
Well, that's a very good question, actually. Thanks. I do have a student who's working on that now. So this European common blue has been here for about 15 years. You know, it was an accident, it came. So it is now part of our fauna. What are the consequences? Hard to tell. So there are cases where invasive species have radical, huge consequences. So for example, the emerald ash borer, because it feeds only on ash trees and because it doesn't have the same natural controls on it here as it does in its home range, has had huge and devastating consequences on destroying ash trees. So that's an invasive species that's in the headlines that everybody's aware of because it's had a huge consequence. The European common blue is a butterfly. Well, one thing that my student is finding out is that the plants that it feeds on are mostly things like clovers, alfalfa, which are also introduced plants. So it doesn't seem to be having a radical effect on destroying local fauna. Is it out competing, you know, native butterflies? There's no, certainly it's much more common in the city, but as soon as you get out of the city, you still see more native faunas than you do the European common blue. So we can't point necessarily to a very strong impact on the way that it's changing ecosystems. So it's just another example of variability, that some introduced exotics have huge impacts, others much less so.
Perfect, thank you. And thank you from Diego in the chat. So we'll move on then to Rebecca's presentation, which will be about birds.
Yeah, I think I need you to stop the screen share so that I can share mine. Okay, just give me a second. All right, can everybody see this? Looks good. Hey, thank you both Carly and Emma. I'm blessed that I work with both of you fairly on a lot of different projects, but I always learn something from you. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm here to talk about really my first love as a biologist, which many of my students don't know, which is actually birds. I did my master's and my PhD on birds. And cities are great place to find lots of birds. There are, of course, more birds outside of the city, but there are lots of interesting birds in the city as well. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about birds today. And this is very basic for any of you who know anything at all about birds. So what is a bird? Well, a bird is descended from a dinosaur. So this is the Archaeopteryx, early bird. And now we have all kinds of birds that have evolved from in these ways from dinosaurs, everything from geese to ostriches and hummingbirds. It's a huge variety in the bird world. Most birds are territorial during the nesting season, at least. That means they defend territories, and the way that they defend territories is usually just using their voices. It's very rare that birds will actually have any kind of physical conflict. They're more likely to be telling each other off. This is a song sparrow, and we can hear that he's singing. And this song is to defend his territory, and also to attract mates. I'm just going to stop him. Only passerines from so a specific order of birds actually sing, so have vocalizations that attract mates and defend territories, but these are about 60% of birds. So a lot of birds sing, even though they're not all called song sparrows. My song sparrow. Many birds are also migratory. So some birds fly from one end of the world to the other. This is the champion, the Arctic tern, that flies from northern Canada all the way to Antarctica. This is a twice-a-year migration. A lot of our birds, though, fly as far as Mexico or further. Central or South America twice a year. So they're quite small, most birds, but mighty, mighty migrators. A lot of birds are also sexually dimorphous, meaning that they have, you can tell the males and the females apart because they look different. There are studies that find that the species that tend to be sexually dimorphic are species that tend to have high rates of parasitism, so that usually the female can judge the health of the male based on how brightly colored he is, or how well he sings, and can tell that a male that's particularly bright or that sings well or that sings a lot is likely to be healthy, not fighting a lot of parasites. How can you meet your avian neighbors? Well, they are all around us. The best thing to do is to open your ears and your eyes. We tend to be distracted when we're outside, but birds really are everywhere. And I not everywhere, but they are common in the city, certainly. And often listening is the first step to identifying a bird, to detecting a bird, is just to pay attention to something that's not human sound. It's a little bit early for fledglings, but pretty soon the chickadees, woodpeckers, some of our resident species that don't migrate are nesting already or will be soon. And we'll see young out pretty soon. You can tell a fledgling from an adult in a few different ways. So a fledgling is a bird that has recently left the nest and is out learning how to fly properly and doing its last stages of development, going through its last stages of development. This here is a fledgling on the left, the adult, the female house sparrow here on the right. And there are a few different ways you can tell. What you can tell is the feathers of this fledgling here aren't quite what they are in the adult. Sometimes they might look puffier. They might have short tails. Often their tails grow last because there isn't enough space in the nest for their tails. And because of that, they fly crooked. So they're learning how to fly. They might not fly very far to begin with. They also have this flap of skin here that's called the gape. And this allows them to open their beaks, to open their mouths really wide, so that they can have a good chance of being fed by the parent. Another way to tell is that they tend to be really loud when the parent is around. Often if you hear a big fuss of a bird, it's because there's a young and it's begging for food from the parent. It can be very, very loud. You can also find nests this way. So if there are young in the nest, you might hear every 10 minutes or so a big cacophony, a lot of bird noise, and that often comes from young in the nest that are hoping to be fed. It is often the loudest mouth that gets the most food, or the one that opens the widest. Nests, you can also find nests by seeing birds. If you start to pay attention to birds and you see them carrying things in their beaks, in their mouths, you could follow them and see where they're going. This is again a house sparrow, which would nest often just in the eaves of a house around here. Inner city birds, a lot of our inner city birds are not native. This is what a rock dove, which is what most people would think of as a pigeon. They are not native to here. They are native to Eurasia, as you can see in this map here, but they are found throughout the world. You can see in the pink on the map. A lot of people aren't big fans of pigeons, tend to think of them as dirty. They are very interesting though, anyhow. If you pay attention, you can see pigeons downtown this time of year displaying. This is a male doing a courtship dance. He'll puff up his chest and drag his tail and strut around the females. And they tend to have this very pretty iridescent feathers here. There's something called pigeon milk, which is the excretions that pigeons feed to their young. It is actually an excretion of semi-digested food, but we call it pigeon milk. They are declining across North America. But this is a typical inner city bird. I'm sure all of you have seen a pigeon. Another typical inner city bird is the European house sparrow. Again, these are not native here. They are alien invasives. They were introduced in mid 19th century in Brooklyn, New York. And they are not just non-native, but invasive because they outcompete native birds for nest sites and for food, especially for holes. They outcompete cavity nesters for holes. They are declining in North America, and they're also endangered in their native Europe, where they're having trouble with some diseases. The peregrine falcon is another bird that you can see in downtown Montreal, believe it or not. These nest in cities. They eat smaller birds. They are native. They have a kind of global distribution where they're native in many places across the world. And these are the fastest things in the air. They can reach a maximum of 320 kilometers an hour. Usually that's in a dive. You can see them dive to catch prey, usually a smaller bird on the wing. So incredibly fast. They almost went extinct in the 60s because of DDT, which was affecting their ability to reproduce properly, but they're doing fine now thanks to DDT bans across the world. And these nests, there's a nest in the Sun Life building. There's a nest in NDG near Girard Park. If you look up, you can often see these birds, and you can identify them flying because of this distinctive shape of the wings when they fly. They're relatively large birds with these kind of V-shaped wings. Another bird that's not quite as pretty, but you will see in downtown Montreal, if you look up, is the turkey vulture. Turkey vultures are native. They winter in the southern US, and then they're here during the summer. They're huge. They have a wingspan of almost 2 meters. And although they're not beautiful, they are very important. They provide a really important ecosystem service, which is that they clean up our streets. So we call them nature's undertakers. They eat dead things. So you'll often see them on the road cleaning up roadkill. They're mostly immune to food poisoning. They have special gut bacteria that allows them to eat things that others can't. And they do perform this really important service for us. And you can see them usually more than one. There are usually at least 2 of them. If you look up, even if you're in the Hall building, the 12th floor of the Hall building, you look out the window, they have a V shape in their wings. Their wings are straight, but they're not flat when they're flying. There's a V shape, and they will also often be circling, these big circles. Other urban birds that you may or may not be familiar with that may be a little bit outside of the urban center include our northern cardinals. Cardinals are year-round residents. That's what they sound like. So you've probably heard them. Cardinals mate for life. Unlike most sexually dimorphic birds, they're also interesting in that both the females and the males sing. And they are very family oriented. You will almost always find the male and the female together, not very far apart. You'll see them having a little conversation with one of them goes chip and the other one goes chip. And whenever you see one cardinal, I say, look out for the second. The American robin is another common bird that you have probably all heard and hopefully seen. This is often the first bird to get up in the morning. Sometimes 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning in May or June, you hear the American robin. So if you're aware of bird songs, this is probably your alarm clock. They nest in trees. They're very early risers. They have these robin's egg blue eggs that you will see, that you sometimes can find pieces of on the ground if you're paying attention. But these are very common in Montreal. And they are present in the winter as well. They don't migrate, but they do gather in large groups and large flocks of robins in the winter that move around. At this time of year, they're starting to establish territories. There we go. Robin. Chimney swifts are also common in the city. They nest in chimneys, hollow trees, etc. They winter in South America. So these are long distance migrants. They eat airborne insects. So you'll often see them in the evening flying and diving and catching insects in that way. Like all of our insectivores and many of our bird species, they have been declining really severely over the past few decades. But you can watch for these in the air in the evenings and watch for that diving behavior. I don't have a song for them because it's usually very high up, so it's hard to get a good recording. This is a black-capped chickadee. The black-capped chickadee is here year-round, and this is probably a sound that you're familiar with, that you may have heard in the winter. In the spring, they sing another song, which I thought I had a recording of, but it's it sounds like they're saying spring's here, and they start that in February. That's my first hint and hope for spring every year. With these tiny little birds announcing that spring is coming. These are native cavity nesters, so they may be outcompeted by non-native cavity nesters like starlings and sparrows. And this is a picture of somebody feeding the chickadees sunflower seeds. They sometimes will be tame enough to eat from your hand in winter if you're careful and quiet. Black-capped chickadees are also amazing. They're very small, but this mobbing call that they have, this dee song that you just heard, it's actually a call, not a song, is this call that they use when there is a danger, and they can call many other chickadees, and also other species will respond to a chickadee's call, and will respond to a chickadee's alarm call by coming to help. So you'll often see a chickadee or a mob of chickadees, and sometimes other birds chasing away a potential predator, like a falcon. So they have this really social, I guess, call that really brings attention and attracts attention to danger. This is the American crow. Some people don't like crows because they can be kind of spooky, but they are amazingly intelligent birds. They eat just about anything. They also mate for life, and they are great family birds. A pair of crows, the young, after they have been raised by a pair, will stick around for at least a year to help raise their siblings. Family groups hang out together during the day, although you may see at night hundreds of crows gathering to roost together in trees to spend the night. During the day, they will split up into their family groups. And they're highly intelligent. This here on the right is a picture taken from a study where in which people wore masks and were banding the crows. And so the crows learned to identify the masks with danger. And even generations after the initial crows had been banded by these masked researchers, it was found that the knowledge of the danger of people in masks had been passed down through generations, and that even those crows that hadn't had direct experience would display defensive behavior when faced with someone wearing a mask like this. Ecological functions and services provided by birds include, so we talked about the undertaker taking care of some of our garbage, really, and the dead things that result from our overuse of cars on roads and from road mortality. They can help control insect populations, so and provide balance in natural systems so that the insects don't damage vegetation too much. They help disperse seeds, so they are planters. They might eat the berries or the seeds, and then defecate and release the seeds with some nice fertilizer as well. They do play a role in pollination. Some birds, mostly hummingbirds, actually do pollinate, but also birds will, studies have found that birds will cause bee pollinators to be more active. So having birds around means that the bees will move more because they'll get startled or scared, and they'll move more between flowers and be more effective in their pollination. So they play a role in pollination as well. And of course, in education and in terms of our mental health and well-being, birds can be very important. How can we take care of our avian neighbors? Well, one of the most important things we can do is keep cats inside. Cats kill up to 4 billion birds. Just in the US every year, they've led to the extinctions of numerous species of birds and small mammals and reptiles. They're among the top 100 most damaging non-native species in the world. So I know many people adore their cats, and our cats can be like family to us. But think before you let your cat roam free. Cats are important predators. Avoid the use of pesticides so our birds have clean things to eat. And advocate for the provision and conservation of habitat, so green space and places where birds can live, feed, and nest. There's just a few sites where you might be able to find more information about birds if you want to know more. And I'll just leave with a quiet moment. Carly talked about the importance of biodiversity for our mental well-being, and for me, this is an example of that. I will stop sharing for now, but I'll put the link to that video in the chat if you're interested. It usually makes me breathe more easily in my stressful moments. That is a montage put together by Dylan Winter, an amazing photographer. And that is a European starlings, a murmuration of starlings, thousands of starlings. You may have seen them do this over agricultural fields, for example. So I'll just put that link in the chat in case anybody wants to check it out, or in case you're ever having a hard moment and you need to remember that the world is a beautiful place. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. You are a veritable encyclopedia of birds. That was amazing. And it's clear that you're very passionate about it, as well as Carly and Emma being very passionate about the species they talked about. We don't have a ton of time for questions, and it seems that all the questions we've gotten so far right now in the chat are for you, Rebecca, about birds. So I wonder if you can actually see the Q&A, Rebecca, if you think there's one that you would particularly love to speak to. And we will be sharing the email addresses to all of our panelists afterwards as well. So if there's any specific questions that you'd like answered, you can get back in touch.
Okay, thanks, Carly. Cassandra, I guess there are a few questions. So the difference between a bird call and a song, maybe I'll take that one. So that was from an anonymous attendee. What's the difference between a call and a song? Not all birds sing, so an ostrich doesn't sing. All birds have vocalizations though, so they all have calls. The difference is what the vocalization is used for. So a song is used specifically during the migration, during the nesting season, to attract a mate or to defend a territory, whereas a call is used to communicate other things. So the cardinals, for example, you'll see usually the males, but also occasionally the females singing their detailed and many versions of their detailed song, often in a high perch, right? And that can be defending their territory. They're getting the word out that they're here and this is their home. That also could be attracting mates if they are not mated. You'll often hear birds counter singing. So you'll hear one cardinal and then, 10 seconds later, you'll hear another cardinal echo that. They're checking in with their neighbors. They're identifying that boundary between their territories, or possibly competing for mates as well. The call, on the other hand, you can hear the cardinals again if you ever see one cardinal and it's making a little chip sound, that's the call, and it's used to communicate usually with its mate. So you'll often hear a second chip, and if you look, you'll see the mate to the cardinal. So the call and the song, different purposes. Let's see, what else do I have?
Is it
a good idea?
Just to note, we've gotten the
ahead.
green light from the Force Space to stay on a few extra minutes to have a chance. So if you wanted to speak, Rebecca, to the next question, and maybe we could also talk about the link between trees, birds, and plants as well, since that ties all these presentations together nicely. So I think Carly could speak to that too.
Okay, so I'll take the bird feeder one then. So is it a good idea to put out bird feeders? Does the rule of not feeding wildlife also apply to birds? This is a controversial question. Personally, because of the risk of cats in the city, it's not always a good idea to put out bird feeders, because you can be attracting, particularly during the breeding season, but even in the non-breeding season, what we're doing with bird feeders is attracting birds to an area that is not ideal habitat for them, usually because of cats. So I think, for example, I don't have a bird feeder in my backyard. I have a big hedge which attracts lots of birds, but we also, all of my neighbors have cats. So I think if I put a bird feeder out and I'm attracting all of those birds to my backyard where there's a high danger of being picked off by a cat, then I'm not doing the birds any favors. That said, I know that, to be able to see birds and appreciate birds, sometimes a lot of people will put out a bird feeder, and it is important to be able to build those connections and learn about our non-human cohabitants of the city as well. So yeah, personally, I don't use a bird feeder, but I know lots of people who love birds who do, because it makes it easier to see them. I just think that the cat issue is one that we really need to consider seriously.
Wonderful. Did you have something you wanted to add to that, Carly? And then I will turn to the question about the scavenger hunt and outline a few of the activities we have planned.
Yeah, so I was going to just make one quick comment on how, I know that we've each been speaking individually about kind of our favorite kinds of biodiversity, the trees or the birds or the insects that we each individually really love and find fascinating. But these, of course, don't live, individually in nature and in our cities. And so I'm going to share one quick slide here that I really appreciate, and this is from my friend and colleague Desiree Narango, who studies trees, insects, and birds, coincidentally. And this is a beautiful kind of comic version of one of her papers by Elsa Cousins, and it talks about how, so as you heard from Emma, many insects are feed on plants, right? Insects, so plants support insects, and the plants we plant matter. So if we plant the right kind of plant, so here, these researchers basically looked all across the US at which plants were most important for supporting. They wanted to know about birds, but to get to birds, you need to go through insects. And so they looked at which plants support certain insects that are eaten by birds. And so by planting certain kind of keystone, really important native plants in our landscape, we can support lots of caterpillars, which essentially means supporting lots of bird food, which means supporting lots of birds. And so these three levels are really, really well connected. And if you want to see birds, like Rebecca suggested, plant a cedar hedge that attracts birds, plant a serviceberry that has birds that are eaten. If you want to see kind of other species in your yard, don't be afraid of insects. Those insects are often what are allowing you to have some of these other species you might want to see, and maybe protecting your plants or pollinating your plants that you want to see as well. And so I think often, many of us think of a particular kind of biodiversity that we really like or we really want to learn more about, and we want to know our trees or our birds or our insects, which is great. Start with whatever you're interested in, but remember that it's connected to the other things too.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. Thank you. So I will just share a few resources, a few next steps for anyone who wants to get involved in what we learned about today. Everyone should be seeing my slides here. Yeah, perfect. Yep. So the resources that were shared in this presentation will be emailed to you after the event. So anyone who is wondering how they could learn more about those, don't worry, we'll be sharing the links, and we encourage you to discover some of those because they're are really excellent tools for not only learning more about your surroundings, but also contributing to our collective knowledge as citizen scientists. So we will send these to you and also include the email addresses for our profs. So if you have any more questions for any of them, if later on you're taking a walk and a question about an insect occurs to you, you'll be able to email Emma about it and find out more. As well, we'll be calling on you to take part in a few associated activities. So I mentioned earlier, this is all part of a larger series called WWF Living Planet at Campus. Today's presenters did an excellent job laying the groundwork for us to learn a bit more about the species that surround us here in Montreal. And then next, we would like you to engage in what you've learned. So later today, we'll be launching an urban biodiversity scavenger hunt where we encourage you as community members to get out in nature and find some of the things that you've learned about today. So our three profs here have done an excellent job preparing a list of trees, birds, and insects that can be found in Montreal at this time of year. So we will encourage you to go out and find them, take photographs, and we'll have a draw prize for participation and a prize for those who find the most species. So we're adding a little competitive element there too. And then on April 8th, we will be hosting a container gardening workshop that'll enable you to plant your very own pollinator garden. And that's to provide habitat and food for some of the pollinator insects that Emma talked to us about. As well, we want to support participation in this activity by giving you some seeds and containers to those who register. And we've got some lovely pollinator species seeds all ready to give away. These are easy to grow and they're going to be lovely and they'll look great in a container on your front stoop or on your balcony. So in summary, you can expect an email from us today with today's recording, with a list of resources and the links to the activities that I've just outlined. And that way you can experience some of these amazing benefits that Carly, Rebecca, and Emma outlined for us today. So without further ado, I'll just thanks once more to our panelists and to our speakers, and I'll hand it over to Anna.
Thanks, Cassandra. You did a great job wrapping that up. We'll remind folks about the scavenger hunt through our social media channels at FourSpace as well, because we're going to pull clips from today's event and send you to the website with all the photos. And then we'll be kind of sharing your photos throughout if you send them in using a hashtag on your social media channels. Anyhoodle, I did want to thank Rebecca, Emma, and Carly for their wonderful presentations. It was a very educational lunch period here for us at the house. We had a good time learning about all these species. And Cassandra, great job with the moderation. Thank you for helping to organize this. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event that Cassandra just mentioned. So please do go on concordia.ca/4 for all the details, event listings for upcoming events associated with ideas of biodiversity, sustainability, etc. Okay, on that note, we kept you here longer than we were meant to, so we wave goodbye and wish you a great afternoon. Enjoy the outdoors today, everyone. Thank you.